Say it was 3 decades ago that I was in a little small women's retreat. Can't even call it a conference. There were probably about 38 of us in that little room. There was a woman that stood up to give her testimony. I will never forget. I was in my 20s at the time. She probably was in her 60s. Her name was Dory Van Stone. We called her Miss Dory. Everybody was hanging on every word that Miss Dory shared with us because as she gave her testimony, it was so riveting and disturbing that it was hard to wrap your mind around. She and her sister were neglected and basically abused at the hands of their mother, the one who was supposed to love them and take care of them. She would leave for days on end, leaving her at 5 years old to take care of her 2-year-old sister. When mom did return, most of the time she was frustrated and just angry that she had kids to begin with. She would tell them that to their face. They knew they were not loved. They knew they were not valued. And because of her anger and frustration, she would often just close the door of a closet, put them inside, and leave them there for hours that would oftentimes turn into days. Dory was recounting how she was trying to figure out how she was going to eat, how she was going to feed her little sister. The bumps in the night would terrify them because they didn't feel protected and covered. She remembers one day her mom coming home and saying, "Hey, we're going to take a little drive." They got in the car thinking that finally this is a day when mom's doing something with us to just enjoy some time together as mother and daughters. They took a drive, a long drive that ended up at a driveway that was long and windy. And that long driveway ended up at a front door where there were stone steps that went up to 2 huge doors, pillars on either side. Mom rang the doorbell, and then Dory at 7 years old can remember that before anybody had even answered the door, she turned around and noticed that her mother had already gone back down the stairs, had gotten in the car, and was driving away. And that was the day they were dropped off at an orphanage. Those 2 girls suffered more abuse in the orphanage than they had at home. From there, they were transferred from one foster home to the next foster home, and their lives really didn't get any better. Along the way, she described the fact that there were some missionaries, some college students, really from a university neighboring, who came by to share Jesus with the kids in the orphanage, and she remembers giving her life to Jesus. And as she described to us on that day, her life from that point forward, she said, "The truth is, my circumstances didn't really change any time soon after I met the Lord." She said, still to this day, she's in her 60s, still to this day, I don't know why the Lord let those circumstances, those difficulties go on as long as they did. But she said, now in hindsight, looking back, there is something I recall that I couldn't put a finger on then, but now I know what God was doing. She said there were often times where I'd be in the dark corners of those closets that I had been locked in. And she said the only way I can describe it is that there was something of a window that seemed to open up, a little veil that was torn down between earth and heaven. She said, I couldn't describe it when I was 6, but now I know that the Lord was giving me opportunity to know that his presence was with me. She said, I would feel a peace that passes all understanding. I would know that I was not alone, even though physically I was. Somehow at 6 and at 7 and at 8 and 9 years old in devastating circumstances, the Lord let this window allow me to know that his presence was with me. Knowing he was near changed everything. I took a break during the lunchtime at that conference. I'm 24 years old, maybe 25. I grabbed one of her books she had written. I don't even know if it's in print anymore, called The Girl Nobody Loved. I sat in the corner with my little box lunch reading through that book, and I'll never forget watching a shadow come towards me and realizing as I looked up that Miss Dory was watching me read her book. She walked over to me, she put her hand on my shoulder, and then she took the other hand and wiped a tear that she saw falling down my face as I read the details that she hadn't been able to share with us in the spoken word. But on the page, what this woman had gone through in her childhood, I could not believe. She saw me crying, walked over to me, wiped the tear. She put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "Sweet girl, don't you cry for me. God was with me the whole time." Knowing he's with you makes all the difference in the world. John is in a dark closet. It's called the island of Patmos. He is in the middle of devastating and difficult circumstances. And this is John, Jesus' disciple we're talking about. This is the one who had walked with Jesus, who had talked with Jesus. This is the one who had been in the presence of Jesus. This is the one who said about his own self in his gospel, I'm the one who Jesus loves. This is the one who had seen Jesus perform miracles. I mean, John was right there when lame folks started walking and blind people started seeing and the deaf started hearing. He heard Jesus preach and teach words coming out of the mouth of the Son of the living God right in his presence. They had heard preaching and teaching before from the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But when Jesus opened up his mouth, something was different. They ain't never heard nothing like this. Think about how you'd feel if Jesus were your Bible study teacher. John was there. He had walked with Jesus in the flesh, but by the time we meet John in the book of Revelation, his circumstance has completely changed. He is now in what some would call the dark night of the soul. He has been exiled to Patmos for his allegiance to Jesus Christ, for his refusal to bend the knee and to go in opposition of Christ and his kingdom. He has been sent to basically what was a place that had been relegated by the Roman government to be for criminals and enemies of the state. And there he sits on Patmos in the midst of difficulty, discouragement, and complete devastation. And in Revelation chapter 4, he says, something happened to me on this particular day. The Lord opened up something of a window, a door between earth and heaven. So even though I was in the midst of difficulty, hardship, devastation, and darkness, I had opportunity to see what was happening in the heavenlies, to catch a glimpse of God's presence and to sense his peace and his power and his joy. And knowing that God was there, John says, that makes all the difference. Patmos was a rock quarry. They would send people there that were a threat to the Roman government, they perceived to be. A rock quarry meaning all day, all they did was hammer at those rocks to basically do work and hard toil. It would have been devastating for their physical bodies, devastating for their souls, not being able to get off of this island, which was 10 miles off of the coast of the mainland in the Aegean Sea. There was no escape, no means of reprieve. The rock quarry would have been like, think Nelson Mandela on Robben Island. You saw or could see the deterioration to Nelson Mandela's body after he was there for those 27 years. How the sun reflecting off of the rocks that were all around caused there to be a glare in their eyes that would deteriorate their eyesight. How breathing in all of the dust that was gathering off of those rocks would cause there to be a deterioration in their lung capacity. In other words, John was deteriorating from the inside out. His circumstances were completely devastating and there was no escape. And he was not in that situation for doing something wrong. He was there for doing something right. I suspect that in a room this size, with this many people in this room and on the other side of the screen, there are so many of you who are amongst hard things on a rock quarry. There's hard things everywhere you look, difficulties everywhere you step. And no matter where you look, it seems like there is absolutely no means of escape. And what makes it hard relationally or financially or in your health or in the raising of kids or in the business or in the ministry this year on Patmos in your life, what makes it more difficult for you to swallow is not that you have been perfect, but you have been purposeful. You've been out in these streets trying to follow God, trying to honor him as a husband or as a wife or as a single person or a parent or a teenager or a university student or a business builder or a ministry leader. You haven't been perfect, but you've been trying to follow God and you've ended up on Patmos anyway. John knows exactly how it feels to be out here honoring God and life be hard. John says, look up. He says, when I looked up, Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, there was a door standing open in the heavens, which means there is access always to God's power, to God's presence, to God's peace, to God's perspective in the midst of difficult circumstances. He says there was a door, and the door was standing open. It was set in the open position, which means there is always opportunity for you and I to lean on the throes of heaven, even while we're standing in the difficult things of earth. The door was standing open. The reason why this little principle of the door standing open, y'all, is so important for believers like you and me to get a grasp on. The reason why it is so weighty right here in this verse is because just several verses earlier, the end of chapter 3, verse 20, Jesus is describing a church at Laodicea, the lukewarm, indifferent, apathetic church. And here's how he describes them. He says, I'm standing on the outside of their door, knocking. I'm hoping somebody's gonna open up this door that has been closed. He is writing about the church. And he says the door of the church has been closed. How Jesus standing on the outside of the door of his own church? Jesus says the church has closed the door to me, which means it is possible for us to be in here and him to be out there. It means it is possible, y'all, for us to be so consumed with personalities and with programs and with platitudes, and we don't even realize that the presence of God is not even in the room. Because we close the door through our indifference. We close the door through our apathy. We close the door through our rebellion. We close the door through our stubbornness. And Jesus, in his grace and in his mercy and in his goodness and his kindness to us, even when we close the door, he's so merciful that he stands on the outside of it, still knocking to have relationship with us. So the reason why chapter 4, verse 1 is so important is because where we close the door in chapter 3, he opens it back up in chapter 4, verse 1. Even when you've closed it, you need to know that the door of heaven is still open. It remains in the open position for you and me, standing on earth with access to heaven.